So I just wanted to make a little addendum to the discussion about correlation is not causation. Um, so, for example, if I said if someone jumped off a cliff and they died after, you'd sort of make the you know that is a case where you'd assume that there is a correlation with causation. So the fact that they died after jumping off a cliff, you'd expect that there would be a correlation between those two events. Um, Unless, say, the person was shot before they jumped off the cliff. But most cases, if someone jumped off the cliff and then they died soon after, you'd assume that there was a correlation between those two events. However, if someone jumped off a cliff and then it started to rain, uh, in most cases, you'd assume that there wasn't a correlation between those two events, and it's common sense to, um, assume that because it's not a kind of repeatable thing. So the notion being that uh, there is a lot of times when correlation does equal causation. And when there's a common sense kind of factor involved, then it's often easy to see. But to say blanketly that correlation is not causation, it sort of can be used as an argument against common sense a lot of the time. So, for example, the notion in the Wuhan that the coronavirus came from the Wuhan lab, basically that because there's a coronavirus that started in Wuhan, and in Wuhan there's a lab that is producing coronaviruses or researching into coronaviruses and doing gain of function research. Uh, you know, People go on about correlation not meaning causation, but it has now been found out that it's pretty likely that the virus did actually come from the lab and that it was covered up. So, yet a lot of people were censored for saying things like that or assuming that there was a correlation between the fact that this Wuhan lab researched coronaviruses and had dodgy safety standards, that there was a correlation between that and uh, the coronavirus outbreak. So we were made to sort of, uh, you know, believe that this coronavirus came from a wet market. Where this virus was meant to have jumped from a pangolin soup or a bat into a human, which flies in the face of common sense. Whereas the other, the other notion or the other cause, there is an obvious correlation, and a common sense kind of correlation where there's a smokestack and in a town and there's a whole lot of smoke coming from that town, you'd assume that the smoke is coming from the smokestack. So this term correlation is not causation is often bandied around by scientists when they are trying to make you believe something that isn't common sense, that is propagated by a pharmaceutical agenda, even though correlation is not causation. Another example of this is the notion that vaccines cause autism, for example. So what Robert Kennedy Jr. says is that there are a whole lot of the amount of vaccinations hugely that they were giving children, the vaccine payload or whatever they like to call it, that they were giving children around the time that there was a mass increase in autism figures, that therefore it's possible, at least, that there's a correlation between autism and vaccines, and that it deserves further research. And most of the argument against that is correlation is not causation, just because there was a big, huge change in the vaccine schedule for children at that time. It doesn't mean because that happened, um, autism was a result of that. Um, you know, and certainly there are other factors that could be involved, like poor diet or change in diet, or but certainly there must be some link as to why autism suddenly increased as an epidemic among American children. And there would be an element of common sense to say that if there was a huge increase in the vaccine schedule and there's a lot of toxicity in these vaccines, that it begs further looking at. So, um, and yet there's a blanket refusal to do that, and almost like a kind of scientific snubbery, using this kind of correlation is not causation kind of uh, dialogue, which I find is really very unhelpful to any kind of common sense argument. And it's got a kind of slant on it where they can use it whenever they want to, sort of say that common sense isn't common sense, kind of thing. Um, Whenever they want to twist a narrative. So that's where I have difficulty with it, because sometimes correlation is causation. In fact, many and oftentimes correlation is causation. It's usually when there's no um, obvious link. Like, for example, if I wave my hands here and someone over in England gets hit by a bird or something, you'd say that there's no correlation between that and the two events. But who knows with the butterfly effect? But anyway, it's what I'm trying to see. It's almost trying to deny there's any kind of natural pattern to the universe in a way, or that because one thing happens, another thing happens. Well, a lot of time there is a link. So it would be better to say correlation does not always prove causation. Um, Sometimes correlation is not causation, but often it is. So something like that. But if there's common sense involved, but yeah, that's just my 2 cents about